How does confession of sin affect the judgment seat of Christ? How does confession of sin affect the judgment seat of Christ? Let me ask the question a different way. Can I confess my sins and therefore escape accountability at the judgment seat of Christ? So get with me Ephesians 4, verse 32. We'll start there. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. Hath forgiven is present perfect. And the idea there, present perfect, is an action completed in the past with effect that continues into the present. So he hath forgiven you. Now let me ask you this question. When you got saved, when someone believes the gospel, does God forgive all their sins prior to that moment, or does he do something more? Does he forgive all their sins up to that moment, but it doesn't cover things in the future? Or does his forgiveness extend to all sins previously committed as well as all future sins? Well, look with me at Colossians 2:13. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 13. And you, being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. Having forgiven is a perfect participle. It reflects a completed action. He's already done it. Colossians 2:13 says the believer already has complete forgiveness. Let me just put it this way. The moment that someone has faith that they believe the gospel and they receive forgiveness of sins, that forgiveness of sins has to apply to every sin they will ever commit, or they're not truly saved. They're not truly declared righteous. If the forgiveness of sins only pertained to what's in the past, what happens the next time they commit a sin? Well, now they're unrighteous, they're guilty before God, and they're in the same predicament. And what happens, by the way, what happens if you commit a sin and you don't confess it? Let me clue you into something. You ready? As a saved person, you've committed more sins than you can even remember. Right? Several more. So if your salvation was dependent upon your confession of sin to receive forgiveness, then we're all in a very bad state of affairs. Look with me at 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 10. The moment you got saved, all of your sins were forgiven. You were declared righteous at that moment. 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 10. And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus. Now notice this, which delivered us from the wrath to come. Not will deliver us from the wrath to come, but delivered us from the wrath to come. Well, if you've been delivered from the wrath to come, what must you possess? You have to possess forgiveness of all of your sins, or you're not really delivered. So the believer already has forgiveness of sins and deliverance from the wrath to come. Now look with me, if you would, at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10. And 1 Corinthians 3 is going to tell us some things about the judgment seat of Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 10. According to the grace of God, which is given unto me, the me is Paul, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. So Paul is the wise master builder. He laid the foundation. The foundation is Jesus Christ. Every believer's work is going to be judged according to that, right? Every believer has the opportunity to build, and they can build with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, and it's going to be tested. It's going to be evaluated by what? Fire. The most obvious example of this, what happens if you find a gold nugget in the wild? Do gold nuggets typically exist in a state of 100% purity? The answer is no. So what do you need to do to separate the gold from the stuff that is not gold? And the easiest way to do that is fire. If you try to get a hammer and you can't really do it that way, right? So the cleanest, most effective way to do it is fire. Particularly, for example, if you're trying to separate gold, silver, precious stones, and wood, hay, and stubble, right? Wood, hay, and stubble have what in common? They're flammable, right? So it's real easy to get rid of those. Now notice verse 14. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. So for the man's work to abide, it has to be gold, silver, precious stones, because wood, hay, and stubble is not going to abide. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. 1 Corinthians 3:15 is one of the clearest eternal security verses. Are there people at the judgment seat of Christ who, when their work is evaluated, will be entirely consumed? The answer to that essentially is yes. And what happens to them according to that verse? They're saved. They don't lose their salvation. So what happens, there's two things that are strongly true, if you will. Salvation is by grace through faith, completely apart from works. Works play zero role in your salvation. You are saved the moment you have faith in what Christ did for you on the cross. You're saved by grace as a free gift of God the moment you have faith. Your works prior to salvation are irrelevant. Your works after salvation are irrelevant to whether you have salvation. Your works play zero role in your salvation. But at the judgment seat of Christ, what is the one thing that is judged? Your work. That's what it says, your work. Now, your work is judged not to determine whether or not you are saved, because you're saved even if there is no work. But your work is judged to determine, according to verse 14, your reward. So your work does matter. Now, get with me 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. What folks will sometimes say is, well, what's tried at the judgment seat of Christ is your doctrine and how pure your doctrine is. But 1 Corinthians 3:13 says the fire shall try every man's work. So it seems that it's not simply doctrine. What's tried is someone's work. Now, some will then say, well, your sins don't really matter at the judgment seat of Christ. Look with me at 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. So what's judged at the judgment seat of Christ? The things you did in the body, and there's two kinds of things you did in the body, whether they're good or bad. So for those that say sin is irrelevant at the judgment seat of Christ, what exactly are the bad things that you did in the body if they're not sin? Right? In fact, tell me if this isn't the case. When you're explaining the gospel to a child and you explain to them what sin is, what is the typical way to explain that? Have you ever done bad things? Have you ever disobeyed your parents? Have you ever told a lie? Well, those are examples of bad things done in the body. And what are they? They're sin. That's what they are. So if you just take 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10 in its natural sense, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body. Does it matter how you live? Well, it surely does. According to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. And here's essentially what's going on. You don't receive any reward for the things before you were saved. You know how I know that? Hebrews 11:6, without faith it is unlikely to please, without faith it is impossible to please him. So was there any action you did before you were saved that God said, well, I've got to give him a reward for that? And the answer is no. So there is nothing prior to salvation that merits a reward. Once you're saved, the rest of your life is, how do I build upon the foundation of Jesus Christ? You weren't building upon the foundation of Jesus Christ prior to salvation. How do you build upon that foundation? And the things that are done in his body, those that are good and bad, those things that are good are obviously gold, silver, precious stones. Those things that are bad are obviously wood, hay, stubble. So does sin matter at the judgment seat of Christ? Well, sin ends up being the bad things, and that wood, hay, stubble is consumed. So let's just think about this just for a minute. When you have wood, hay, and stubble, when you have those bad things that are consumed, does that change the fact that you have forgiveness of sins? It doesn't. Because 1 Corinthians 3:15 was absolutely clear that the person was saved, yet so is by fire. It didn't affect their salvation in any way. There is no sin you can commit as a believer that's going to cause you to earn God's wrath. But does our behavior matter? Look with me at Galatians 6, verse 7. Galatians 6, verse 7. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. If I plant thorns and thistles, am I going to get watermelons? You're not. You reap what you sow, right? If you plant something, that's what you're going to get. That's how it works. Verse 8, for he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Now those verses are not about you have to work for your salvation, but those verses are about the reality that as a believer, your reward is you reap what you sow. If you sow good things, you reap a reward. If you sow evil things, then you reap, wood, hay, and stubble that's consumed at the judgment seat of Christ. So let me give you a hypothetical. Someone is saved and they lead a wicked life as a believer. They do all kinds of bad things. And then right before they die, they say, aha, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to confess all my sins, and therefore it's not going to be a problem at the judgment seat of Christ. Well, what happens with that? Well, here's the way to think about this. Before the person confessed their sins, before they did that lengthy confession, did they already have forgiveness of those sins? They already had forgiveness of those sins. So confessing those sins didn't get them any forgiveness, right? Because they already had it. Does confessing those sins somehow turn wood, hay, and stubble into gold, silver, and precious stones? It doesn't. I mean, wouldn't that be nice if it did? Lord, take all the wood, all the hay, all the stubble, rewrite history, and convert those into gold, silver, precious stones. That is a prayer that cannot be answered. It's not going to work, right? What happens at the judgment seat of Christ is not God pouring out wrath on the believer's sins, because the sins have already been forgiven. But what happens is the believer's work is evaluated, and confessing the sins can't make wood, hay, stubble somehow miraculously turn into gold, silver, and precious stones. It just doesn't work that way. If you could confess your sins and therefore avoid accountability at the judgment seat of Christ, if they somehow turned into gold, silver, precious stones, according to Galatians 6:7, that would be God being mocked, right? God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. So back to the original question, can I confess my sins and avoid accountability at the judgment seat of Christ? No. No, you can't do that. You already have forgiveness of sins as a believer. You're not going to lose forgiveness. You have forgiveness of sins from the moment you're saved. You'll never lose it. When you commit sin as a believer, it doesn't cause you to lose your salvation. It doesn't cause God's wrath to abide on you. What it causes is it affects your reward. Can God give you a reward for bad behavior? He can give you salvation as a free gift. That he can do. But can he give you a reward? Say, your behavior, all those sins you committed, I want to give you a gold medal for that. God can't do that. He can't do that as a reward. He can give you salvation as a free gift, but he can't reward you for bad behavior. That would be God would be mocked in violation of Galatians 6, verse 7.